Good. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Team, I'm happy for you to close the door at the back. Let's keep it warm and cosy. My name's Joe Clarke. I don't know anything about ecology because I work in Holbeton farm. It's very sterile, but I'm very pleased to invite you all to listen to these wonderful speakers. I've got a lovely lineup and they're all raring to go. So we're just going to pass straight in, if that's all right. First slide, please go. So I think the reason I'm here, and I think that you're here, is because you're all in some way interested in the state of the planet and how we can do something close to home to improve that state. Next slide, please. And every time you see the news, something is going on somewhere in the world that goes, oh, is that really happening? And then a couple of years ago, something happened that is frankly out of the movie, and we're all not allowed out of the homes, and it's all becoming too apparent and too close to home. Next slide, Kieran. Wherever you go in the world, there's a landscape that needs to provide for everybody, whether that's just us or all of the rest of life around us. We're quite lucky, our landscape isn't actually very brittle, we can do lots of things to it and it generally looks pretty much the same, but everywhere else in the world, or there's lots of places in the world where they don't have that luxury. I think we're in a privileged position where it's quite easy for us to work and do things for nature in that respect. Next slide, thank you. The UN has released a report that basically tells us we're getting things a bit wrong when it comes to biodiversity. For the last 50 years, everything's gone on the downer. And unfortunately, despite our landscape not being so brittle, we are part of that problem. Next slide. Good, so I've set off the bomb, and all I'm going to do now is tell you about the tiny little thing that we're all doing together as a community over the last 12 months, the Bird Box project, and then I'm going to leave it to my lovely speakers to try and bolster that with some real stuff. So, straight into that. Next slide. Yeah. So this is my other life outside the hospital, where we have a play at being in the countryside, and we have a bit of a small holding just for fun. And by doing that, I've come to know a few things that I'm frankly just getting wrong and need to think a little bit more about. Next slide, Kim. So in January last year, we set up the Holbeton Bird Box project with the aim of increasing a few bird populations. We started with tit boxes just to work on the tit species that Robbie will tell us about later. It was in lockdown, so everyone had to come and collect their kit, make them at home, bring them back, and then the team put up about 40 odd, and they all got mapped. In addition, the Devon Bird Society gave us these, well, let's go to the next slide, so there's a slightly better picture. Those aren't the tit boxes. These are the tit boxes. These are the house-martin nesting cups. So Devon Bird Society gave us these, and I think there's about 50 cups in total spread around the village, supporting that population of birds. And all of those boxes and cups that have gone up so far are mapped on the Google interactive map, which you can get the link for and wander around and see all the pictures of the birds and check it's the right one. And some of them, it'll show you what's hatched out in spring last year, and we'll keep updating that year on year. Next slide, please. I'd just like to say thank you to Young Community Energy and the Holbeton Parish Council for giving the first 2 tranches of funding to make those projects possible. So thank you to them. And next slide. The next stage of the logistical bit, which is the bit that I'm involved in, is to try and support swifts, which Robbie will talk about in more detail. The plan that I'm taking good advice about is to put 15 boxes in and around the village, and also incorporate a new electronic swift call to try and bolster the population and attract more in. Next slide. Unfortunately, swifts are declining, like everything else in the graph we saw earlier. There's a gentleman called John Stimpson who lives up in the east of England who has spent a few decades now building swift boxes at cost and sending them out, and he's just got to a total of 30,000, which is an incredible feat. So it's just nice that actually it's not a lone project. You know, every little helps across the United Kingdom, and if we can do our little bit in our community, actually it's part of a bigger thing. And actually John's very happy to send us a free box. We're going to take it apart, make templates, and just copy his design. So that's what we're going to do. For that, I've estimated that we need about 300 squid. For the boxes, materials, wooden screws, and a cool. So I'd be very grateful if at the end of tonight you haven't spent it all on beer, whether you might give Martin Battergill a bit of money to raise money for the next phase of this project. And I think, Kieran, that is it. Good. That's me done. So I'm delighted to start going through our list of speakers and to start with John Mildmay-White. John and Lily own the Flete estate and look after their family of 3 children, and I'm very interested, as you would be, in hearing about John's wonderful plans. Take it away.
Right, thank you for that introduction, Joe. Can everyone hear me at the back? Yes. Very good. I think my involvement in this talk started probably back on April the 2nd, is it? On my father-in-law's birthday, which traditionally every year we tap into the cider barrels that we made the year before and sample them until about 2 o'clock in the morning. This year, due to COVID, we had a collection of 6 socially distanced people doing that, and Joe was one of them. And after a few at about 1 o'clock in the morning, he started with his very relaxed, uninterrogative style of asking me, what am I doing on the estate? What's going on? You know, what's it all about? We had a good long discussion. He said at the end of it, well, actually, I think more people would like to hear about this, of what you're doing. They may agree, they may disagree, but people just want to know. So that was the start of today, really. I forgot what I told him at that time, so I'm going to have to make it up again, I'm afraid. Initially, I titled my talk, The Flete Estate Holistic Context. Some of you may be asking what a holistic context is. The idea of a holistic context is, firstly, the holistic part. All ecosystems or companies operate as a whole. The idea. So they're not just sort of singular entities, little cells, but they all interact. So you need to understand the whole in which you're operating in. And for the estate, that's the whole of the estate, the people you affect, the people that affect you. And then the context. The context is, what do you want from it? Every time you set an objective or ask a question, you need a context to see, well, am I answering that question right? Am I answering the question badly? So I prepared about 15 slides of text and detail about the holistic context, and spoke last night to Lily, and by slide 2 she told me it was boring. So I've changed that, onto the next slide please, and I've rephrased it really as a single question. How should Holbeton, the community of Holbeton, the village and around Holbeton, look in the next 30 years? Now 30 years is sort of quite an arbitrary number, but 30 years is the time in which hopefully I'll be starting to look at retiring, my boys will be taking it on, and what do I want it to look like for them? So for me it's quite a good baseline. Right, move on to the next slide please. So that's the question, how should Holbeton look in the next 30 years? Yeah, thanks. Does anyone know what this is? Shout it out. Very good, everyone knows GCSE maths. Does anyone know what this Venn diagram's called?
Sustainability.
That's it, the sustainability triple bottom line. Really interesting stuff. But I think really for us in this talk, it should be rephrased, because at the moment we all know sustainability is not enough. We cannot sustain the position we are in. We cannot sustain what we're doing to the climate, cannot sustain what we're doing to biodiversity. So it really should be called the doing better than sustainability and possibly improving triple bottom line, but we'll have to rethink what we're going to call it. But this is really, sorry, go back, this is really what I, in terms of my decision making and looking forward on the estate, try and think about. So in terms of people, that's the community, that's everyone here. I think in Holbeton we're fantastically lucky with the community. We've got the village hall, the pub, the shop, the church, the school of course, the preschool that's now in the school. You've got all your different clubs, societies, everything that's run here that really brings everyone together. The orchard groups, brings everyone on different levels and comes in. And really, this village, we have to sustain that. We've got to keep pushing that, but that takes injections of people and injections of energy. The dirty word down here is profit. But as you see, you can't really sustain a community and you can't sustain a planet and doing good things to the planet without the profit. But it's about restructuring how you look at the profit. So down here, you look at the maximum output you can do. But within here, there's something called maximum sustainable output. So taking an agricultural point of view, take a piece of land. If you take a crop from it, and take a crop from it, and take a crop from it, and I'm feeding it somehow, you can't sustain that. And so it's looking at how we can take the crop from the land, but then sustain that, so for future generations, we can keep taking that crop from the land without pouring on chemicals, pouring on other things. And the last one is the planet. Now the planet, really, I think at the moment we're facing 3 major issues, and Joe touched on some of those earlier. So number 1, you've got the climate emergency. Things are getting hotter. I mean, spring has arrived now at the end of January, beginning of February, seasons are changing, and I think we can't deny it. We probably can't deny the rate that it's happening, we can't deny that it is happening. There's also the biodiversity crisis. We know that there's a drop in invertebrate numbers. We know there are drops in bird numbers. And finally, water quality. I think the village is very aware of the issues that we have with water quality, the issues we have with South West Water, the impact that agriculture plays on that, the impact that people's own personal septic tanks that play into that. So we've got to try and look at improving those. So really, in terms of the planet, we try to look for healthy soils and creating healthy habitats, enhancing our habitats. We need to be monitoring our carbon and reducing our emissions and moving towards a net zero future. And we need to be doing it quite quickly. Next slide, please. So this is what I think we should be doing, and I'd like just to talk about a few things that we are trying to do on the estate to start with, and we've got a few people here that are going to talk about some of those in more detail. The first, we've got Johnny, who's going to talk about the farming we're hoping to do at Brownsville and Mycelium farms. So we're looking at some rotational mob grazing, looking at building the soil structure, building the soil fertility. Next slide, please. And Robbie will also talk about some habitat works we're doing under the FIPL Farming in a Protected Landscape scheme. So that's looking at joining up connected habitats, some tree planting, pond creation, again just creating a little space for nature rather than handing over the whole farm, taking out corners, taking out hedges that can improve. Next please. He'll hopefully also talk about the farm cluster. So this hasn't been approved yet by DEFRA, but informally we've been working as a group of farmers, landowners, land managers, as a bigger land mass. So we can look at, if we're going to do some habitat works, well, how does that tie up with the next holding and the next holding and all look together? I think this is going to give the best outcomes and also give the best chance to support farmers in the community at achieving the payments that are going to come out from the government and supporting our farming community here. Next slide, please. The Fleet Field Lab. This is fascinating, and I'm really keen to get as much research and investigation taking place on the estate because it brings in new ideas. So Frank and Shelley have been captivated by Mycelium and biochar and have been looking at how this can be used to do many, many things. And Frank will talk a lot more detail on this later. It's exciting looking at soil improvements, looking at water filtration, amongst other things. Next, please. We're also in discussions with Natural England looking at a possible opportunity to divert the weir because of the issues that we've got with the salmon and the sea trout coming up the river and spawning further up. And finally, the last one is the carbon. So really as an estate, we've got to look at what our carbon footprint is, starting with carbon footprints in the farms, but also trying to bring our first property over to totally renewables and try to be self-sustaining. Obviously planning issues involved with a lot of that, so we'll see how that goes. The message we're getting, and if you read the news and watch everything, is look, you know, the world's in trouble. It's all quite depressing. But I think there are lots of things that we can do, and I think there are some really positive things coming out. And we can all work together and really sort of bring ideas in. That's my main message from tonight, really. Sorry, my voice has got all dry, I'm not crying. That's all from me, really. Just to say, I'm always open to discussions on new ideas with people. But I'll hand over now to the next speaker who will go into a bit more detail.
Great, thank you, John, for that insight. So our next speaker, I'm pleased to say, is very important locally because he's working with John and also with Jeff Sayers from Carswell, and I think with Harry from another farm. And the importance of that is that this is a joined-up approach. This is not people having small ideas in small places, and Robbie is going to be spearheading a lot of the ecology work. I can't begin to thank him enough for all the work he does for the Little Bird Box project, because all of that he's doing out of the kindness of his own heart. And without his advice, we'd be on a hiding to nowhere. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Robbie to come and tell you a little bit about ecology in that area. Oh, scrap that.
John here's going, oh, but this used to be I'm working with them.
You should have said something. Rewind. I won't introduce Robbie later because I think I did quite a good job of that. John, you're really important as well. Really important.
I was getting really confused.
But we are going to move to John and Haimes next. So John,
yes.
this is quite a cute story because John, I don't know where you were born, but John went to the local village school here in Holbeton before taking over his family farm in Sherford and also farming at Saltram. And John is going to be telling us all about how he's going to help with the new farm setup at Mycelium and Brownsville. John, it's been a great pleasure to introduce you.
It's a bit weird weird being up here actually, because the last time I was up here I was a sheep. Activity. And I didn't have a talking part either, so yeah, it was a bit different. But I thought I'd start with just explain a bit of my background. So I came back to our family farm in 2014, and we were sort of traditional mixed farming, and I worked. I felt like I worked quite hard for a couple of years. I didn't really understand what was going on. I felt there were some things that weren't quite right. We were spreading quite a lot of artificial fertilisers on some of our cropping ground. We were spraying pesticides and herbicides. And I think what did it for me is that we were growing some maize. And I remember looking at a field of maize in the autumn and seeing it raining and just watching the soil run off this field of maize. And I thought, this is just all wrong to me. So I was looking for a different approach, and I came across a regenerative agriculture, which the sort of main principles are that you disturb the soil as little as possible, you keep something growing on the soil or keep it covered with manure or compost, you have as much diversity in the system as possible, and you get livestock back onto those farming systems. So I went about changing our system. I had to make it pretty simple because I need simple, really, nothing too difficult. And so we went about making everything grass and just having a group of cattle to graze that grass, basically. So if we could have the first slide. So this is, and then John asked me, he's like, well, could we do a similar thing here? And I said, yeah, we might be able to do that. Yeah. So this is basically what it is. It's rotational grazing. So on the left-hand square here, the left-hand side here, we've got that's a cow in let's say one field. So that cow's out in that field all summer. It sort of mills around the field, it chews a piece of grass, it sits in the same place, it goes back and will chew that bit of grass that it likes a couple of days later. The middle square is now we're starting to say, right, that cow, will be in one quarter of that field for a week, maybe 2 weeks, then we'll shift you to the next one. And then wait for a couple of weeks. So it's starting rotational grazing, but we're not quite there. But the third one is where we want to get to, really. So we've got good density of cattle in small areas for very short periods of time. So in effect, we're resting that little square until they've done all the other squares. If we could go to the next slide. So the benefits of that are, you can see on that right-hand side is the grass growth rate, basically. So you can see that it's sort of exponential in that second phase. In that set grazing system, that cow's always going back to that nice bit of grass it likes and eating it at this stage. So it never gets a chance to get through that exponential bit. And that's all we're doing. We're resting grass, letting it grow big root systems, so it's got more resilience, more drought tolerance. We're building soil quality, soil biology from those good root systems and making the system more resilient. If we go to the next slide. This is a picture of actually at West Sherford, so you can see a group of cattle there. I've electric fence behind, and they're in a section there. Quite tall grass. We had some really dry years when I started this, so we were sort of doing a form of mob grazing where I was holding the cattle back on longer grasses, which I might have otherwise cut. So at Brownsville Minchin Hay, we'll have this, about 150 cattle in the group. They'll be moved every 2 or 3 days. Ideally, it would be shorter than that, but it depends what labour you've got. Using electric fencing, we won't use any artificial fertiliser. We'll use absolutely no sprays. I'll be measuring grass and sort of planning ahead so that if the grass stops growing, we can start making decisions about what we do with those cattle. There'll be no overwintering, so we'll sell all the cattle in the autumn, and we won't be, at the moment, we might choose to, but we won't be ensiling or cutting any grass. Wow. If we could have the next slide, please. So over Minchin Hay and at Brownswell, there were some cropping areas, traditional rotational arable fields, and John's planted herbal lays or mixed species lays into these areas. So it's a real mix of grasses, legumes, different herbs. You can see here we've got some chicory, a lot of red clover in these lays. So it's great for pollinators, great for the soil because you've got a real mix of rooting depths. All the plants are growing at different stages through different times of the year. And so it's great for biodiversity. Deep rooting like the chicory, the plantain, red clover is quite deep rooting. It's great for drought tolerant if we get a dry time. And also the cattle do really well on it. Those plants are pulling up different minerals from different parts of the soil, and the cattle can sort of pick and choose to, what they're eating. If we go to the next slide. I just wanted to quickly mention biodiversity. So what in effect we're doing is building the biomass in the soil. And as soon as you start doing that, it has a really positive effect for the rest of the sort of trophic levels. So more earthworms, more birds, more field mice I'm seeing, and here we've got cattle egrets. I've got about 25 cattle egrets. This is us at the moment. We bale graze over winter at home, and we've got about 25 cattle egrets picking at the invertebrates around the soil, around the cattle, which is great to see. Go to the next slide. Oh yeah, this is just my shameless plug at the end. That's how big boxes say. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Johnny. Sorry for forgetting you briefly there. Robbie, as earlier.
Hello, I'm Robbie. I'm working with John across the Flete estate and also with the Bird Box project at Holbeton as the ecologist and advisor and general answer of random questions, basically. So I'm going to talk about some of the wildlife across Holbeton and the wider area, the wider landscape. Next, please. So the Bird Box project's probably one of the first things I got involved with the community. So I helped Joe design some of these boxes and pick where to put them. This is Joe putting one up last year down on the estuary, and these boxes were sort of a first step to putting something up for wildlife. Generally they were targeted at sort of blue tits and great tits, so they're again quite common species, but with any species you never quite know its future, so even though it may be supporting something that's currently common, in the future it could become something that's actually far rarer and therefore needs support. They've done really well. We've had 10, 15 pairs in the boxes, so this is one of the boxes. It's got 10 chicks in it. You can see one just sticking its head out of the hull, not while fledging. These boxes also support other things as well, not just birds, so there's also dormice that can use them. Even though they have a box with a hole at the front, they can actually crawl around on these boxes and go in them. Next slide. So that's moved on to a different range of species we're now working on. Does anyone know what these four are? Joe?
Not clear.
Anyone have a go? Yeah, so I heard house martins. House martins on the top left, top right is swallow, bottom left is swift, and bottom right is sand martin. So 3 of the 4 you'll see quite commonly around here. Sand martin's the only one that we probably won't see much down here apart from on migration. There's no sort of sandy riverbanks for them to nest in. So they're all quite similar, but they each got like a unique feature. So the one with the long streaming tail is the swallow, and it also has a nice red chin. Then the house martin and the swift both look quite similar, but one has a white belly, and both have the same sort of shaped forked tail. And the swift's got a very dark belly, but also size-wise is about twice the size. Next slide. So there's a close-up of them. And the house martin also has a very white rump, so that's when you see it turning over the fields, you see a white flash. If you don't see the white flash, it's probably a swallow feeding over the fields, or if it's higher up, it would be one of the swifts. So they each nest around buildings generally, or that's where they're now found, but they nest in very different places. So something like a swallow will nest around farmyards and in stables and within a building structure usually. House martins will go and nest on the nest cups outside, so they'll make a mud nest cup that's usually stuck underneath the eaves, and they close the nest almost entirely and just leave a little gap for the adults to access the nest. So that's, you're currently putting up some nest cups, and they're like a woodcrete structure. You get double cut, and then they'll come along in the spring and fill in that last little section so they completely seal off the cup just with a little gap for them to get in. Swifts instead actually nest within buildings, so they don't nest on the outside, but you can get them to nest if you provide a box. So these are some swift boxes. They come in a whole range of different designs, but the basic function of them is they have a hole and a chamber and a little egg cup at the back. So swifts are a bit unusual. Unlike most birds, they don't breed in their first year. So the swifts that fall out the box as they fledge in August time will have been abandoned about 2 weeks before by the adults, and then I've had enough food provided to them before the adults abandon them to actually continue growing, and then they'll fledge the nest, fly off, and they won't land on the ground again for usually 2 years, so they'll be on the wing for 2 years. So they do a thing called hemispheric sleep, where they sleep one half of their brain at once, and therefore they can keep flying the whole time. So the swifts that do fledge can come back in the first year, and now the ones that you'll see screaming around. So next slide. So there's a video here. It's got some sound, but it's quite quiet.
Make the noise, Robbie.
It has no sound. So they go like that. They have a scream like wee wee, and you'll have a whole party flying around. So you'll see a party just flying across the screen. So they fly as a group round, and most of these ones you see flying around are actually non-breeding birds prospecting the area. So when they're doing this, you can actually attract them to a new colony. So they're looking for a colony to nest with. So they like to nest near each other. So on the house there, you can see there's 3 swift boxes just about under the eaves. Oh, it's the latest one.
It's incredibly quiet, but
So if anyone ever goes to France, where in the summer, lots of the villages around there still have parties of screaming swifts. In the UK, it's less common now, but particularly around big industrial areas and bigger cities, there are still good colonies of swifts. In Devon, probably one of the best places to go is a place called Drew Stainton, up at Dartmoor. They had 0 swifts about 20 years ago. It was one person who started a bird box project there for them that's now got up to about 35 breeding pairs. So both swifts and house martins are both called red listed species. They're basically of highest conservation concern. They're under threat at the highest level. So they're sort of the key things we're now looking to work on. And whatever, next species. Next slide. So a house sparrow is the final one. So again, it may be a really common bird and you think, oh, it's all over the place, but they've declined about 85% over the last 40 years. People didn't really know why, because they just didn't study them, because they were so common, they were all over the place, more common than anything else in the UK. But now they've pretty much collapsed, and you may still have a few colonies left in the village, but at one point they would have been found much wider across the landscape. So this may be a third box project we look at doing. These again like to nest as a group, and these are like terrace boxes, so they actually got 3 boxes in one, and they have this entrance on either side, and they like to sit next to each other and chirp to each other, basically. Next slide. So what's the point of all these bird boxes and all of this? So about 2 years ago, I started a series of baseline bird surveys across a much wider area. So there's 8 survey areas that, 7 survey areas that have been completed. So there's 24 visits done with myself and a group of volunteers from Devon Birds. So we've done Minchin Hay, Brownswell North, Brownswell South, 2 routes on the estuary, both in the woods and on the water, South Battersborough and Wannell Cliffs. So most of Flete's now been covered. That's given us quite a good picture of what's there. So we've counted just over 15,500 birds, and that's of 93 species. A lot of these are quite common ones, but it gives you a good idea of general populations of what's there, and it gives us something to work from and a sort of ground zero to go from to look at improving that, and that leads on to next slide. Habitats. So the bird surveys have basically informed us. And I specialise in birds. That's the thing I'm most interested and most knowledgeable in. And I use them as sort of like a proxy to inform general wildlife and habitats. So if the bird populations are good, generally you're looking at most other things are decent, because the insects will be good, and then the small invertebrates in the soils will also be good. So doing the bird surveys has sort of helped us design a whole of habitat improvements across Flete. So you can't probably see very well on there anything that's written. But the darker green areas we're now looking at creating more permanent meadows, so looking at the grazing timing. So within the rotational grazing system, these fields might be skipped 1 or 2 grazing rotations during the spring and summer, so that will then allow the whole of that sort of community to flower fully and start to seed before then you come and bring the cattle in. So that then gives more pollinators a chance of bees to feed off there. We've also been planting a lot of scrub pasture, so it's not woodland and it's not parkland trees, it's something sort of in between, and it's a low density planting of a range of different species, and that's providing lots of extra nectar, lots of extra berries in the winter, nuts as well, field dormice, and they're being planted in some strategic places across the estate to try and link up existing woodlands and corridors. Next please. So we've also got some meadow reseeding that's taking place, parkland trees, and about 15 ponds going in. And again, this is looking at trying to provide water in the landscape. So despite Flete being very large, there's quite a lack of open water apart from the estuary, or standing open water. So ponds are something that would have been quite common across the farming landscape, and they've been lost over the decades as they become a nuisance to plough around and have been infilled. So we're looking at putting some of those back in and providing something for wildlife. Next, please. So, sort of this is leading on to my sort of idea of the way things are going with future farming. It was about trying to get that balance between having a farming system that functions and is profitable, but also looking at how you can integrate wildlife into that farming system. So that may be, like John was saying, having a corner of a field just taken out of management and providing like a little habitat sort of pocket. It may be the way you manage the hedgerows, maybe the timings of your grazing. Next, please. So this example, these are all taken down at Carswell. So this is looking at timing of, the top right is taken at South Battersborough, the other two at Carswell. So looking at timings of grazing, just by taking that intensity of grazing off during a short period in the spring, that will allow all of your flowers to fully bloom. There's a huge number of bees that are down there now. The top right is full of, it looks like a dandelion, but it's on a much longer pendulous stem. So they're hawksbits and hawksweeds. If you walk along the south coast on the coast path this spring, you should see some fields that look like that. And then you also got this purple one, which is a devil's bit scabious or field scabious, that again would have never had a chance to flower because it would have been grazed off. So it's looking at how you graze and when you graze. Next, please. But it's also looking at what the current farm system may provide, basically spontaneously for wildlife. So farming can create opportunities for wildlife without really planning. So this is a bit of fencing that was done, and in the process they had to take the bank away to fit the fence back in. And actually, it may look messy and untidy, but this bank here had well over 100 mining bees nesting in it. So a whole colony had set up. And these, unlike honeybees, don't nest as a colony, but they nest as individuals. So each one of those little holes, you can just see here, has a mining bee that's gone down there. It's taken lots of pollen down there. It's laid its eggs, and that will be sealed off, and that will then sit there all winter long through the storms. And then the following year, you'll get the bees emerge again. So they do provide, even existing farming systems can provide places for wildlife by chance almost. But it's about knowing those. Next, please. So around Holbeton, you might start to see some things changing slightly. So these pictures aren't from Holbeton, but they're showing sort of mob grazing of cattle within a wood pasture system in the centre. So that's within sort of a cherry orchard. There's some scrub pasture on the right that's more developed, and on the left there's one that's developing. So it looks quite tall and rank in the summer, but you can come through and graze after about 3 or 4 years, 5 years. You can start to graze this with smaller stock, and then as it becomes more mature, you can graze it with larger stock. But it's creating a far more variety for habitats for wildlife by having these just pockets, not across the whole area, but just little isolated sections that then link up across a much larger landscape. Next, please. So we've started this planting already. So this was taken yesterday. We planted 450 plants of 13 different species. We planted up 4 sites yesterday, and we have 2 more to do. So I think John might want some extra help at some point, but I'm sure he might say. And these again are very low density, but these are nice river valley through here. So that's also going to have a series of leaky dams running up through. It's about holding the water in the river systems. So it creates a wetter valley bottom. And then it will have this sort of softer edge, rather than it being field wood, it will have these softer edges between a field and a wood, where basically it's a corridor things can move through across the landscape, across the farming system. Next, please. So, I had a really poignant statement to say. I was told I had to say something very poignant at the end, didn't I?
That's right.
So, if you can help in helping planting, that would be good. But even doing something just in your own garden, just providing some extra flowers in the garden. So, Kieran was saying, who's a bee expert, what was the flower?
This one?
Comfrey. No, not comfrey. No, the flower that you said that was good. So borage. So borage is a really good flower you can plant in gardens. So it's you can eat it as well. But it's one that is sort of a range of bee species were all like. This isn't borage, by the way. But there's a whole range of different things you can plant for wildlife. So basically, if you can each make a small change and small actions by lots of different people, can create basically a landscape scale of change. So anyway.
Thank you.
Good, thanks a lot, Robbie. That's really good. So our next speaker is Alice Lewthwaite, who is heading up a group that meets in the pub, and this is really a social group for people who have an interest in talking about soil because of all the things it can do for anything else. But it's getting back to the root of the problem. So, Alice,
Terrible.
Thank you.
Borage is very good in pims. So, yeah, it has beautiful flowers and you can eat them and put them on salad. So I'm Alice Lewthwaite and I'm here to talk about, next slide please, Soil Ed. So very kindly it was named by John. It's soil education rather than anything more grim. And we're a community interest group that meets in the pub every other month over a beer to talk about soil. Next slide please. So soil, why soil? I mean, you know, so I had my soil moment, as it were, about 18 months ago when I was doing a Masters in International Development with Social and Environmental Justice, which is quite a mouthful. And I was given an essay that I had to do about climate change policy and what policy did I think would have the most impact if it was properly implemented around the place. So I started doing some research and I thought about greenhouse gases and transport. I thought about our textile industry and our clothing, which we tend to move fast fashion and throw things away. And I started coming across articles about soil and how soil actually can sequester or store carbon from the atmosphere. And soil actually stores across the planet more carbon than all the forests and all the plants that we have. And I started coming across some of the things that Johnny's been doing with his mob grazing about regenerative agriculture as well. And when I was thinking about future generations, as my cousin has been doing about his boys and the Flete estate, I was starting to think about the fact that 95% of our food is grown using some kind of soil. So I thought, well, if there's no food for my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, life is going to be pretty grim. And realised that soil was probably something I wanted to learn a bit more about. So when I came down here, we started thinking about soil. And this is no dig at all to any farmer in the room, because the farm system that we've had across the planet, probably not very long ago since the Second World War, has been increasingly focused on using inorganic fertilisers, also pesticides and monocropping. And actually soil doesn't really like that. Soil is amazing because it has a huge diversity within it. So if you took a gram of soil, it would have over 10 billion organisms within it. And in fact, soil contains half the species of the entire Earth within it. And as Frank will tell us in a minute, we don't know very much about it probably, and we're learning quite a lot about it. So it is amazing stuff. And it is what grows what we eat. And I'm very passionate about having a living landscape where we can grow food and look after the planet and have the profit that we talked about in John Mildmay-White's talk as well. So next slide, please. One of the things we think about is the soil food web. So this is the way that soil interacts together in an amazing way when you start to add species together. So when Johnny was talking about the mob grazing and the herbal lays, you get a lot of different plants working together. And in fact, trees that Robbie would know talk to each other within the wood, and the soil is all part of that. So it's all about all the things that live within the soil. Some of them are tiny, like tardigrades or nematodes, and some of them are much bigger, like earthworms or things that feed off them. But all these things we're learning are interlinked. And there's a lovely woman called Dr. Elaine, what's she called? Ingham, who coined the phrase the soil food web. And so we want to learn more about that in this group. Next slide, please. So our next meeting is on the 22nd in the Fox House in Brixton. And anyone's welcome. You don't have to be a farmer, you might just have your garden, you might just be interested in soil. And we're going to be actually hopefully looking at soil under the microscope, because Johnny's got a new microscope. We might not know exactly what we're looking at because we're not experts at all, none of us are. We hope to have Dr. Christian Taylor coming to join us, who works with Frank actually, and is a fungal expert. He's hoping to come over, and that will allow us to actually know what we're looking at. The other thing we're going to do is to, at the Oxford Real Farming Conference this year, there was a session around SHAPE, which is the Soil Health Action Plan for England, which the government and DEFRA have been developing, and they had some really great speakers, and it's available on YouTube. So we often watch something and then we can discuss it as well. But we also talk a lot about farming in general, many other things. So please do come and join us. So come and talk to me afterwards if you're interested, and we'd love to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. All the things I definitely couldn't have said, so that's really lovely. And it's a very relaxed atmosphere at these groups, so if you just want to come for a drink and listen, that is also absolutely fine. Our final speaker, last but not least, is Frank, who's started a really interesting project on Flete, looking at mycelium biochar and its properties and what it might be able to do for us. And because I don't understand it, we definitely need Frank to tell us all about it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Joe. Yeah, if you want to go on to the first slide. Yeah, I'm Frank. Shelley, my other half, she isn't with us tonight, but between us we've over some time been quite passionate and interested in the environment, concerned about the environment. We've been living here in the South Haimes for 15 years. My background's engineering, but I did grow up on a cattle farm. And I have been working in engineering rail systems mostly for most of my working life, all of my working life really. Shelley is an artist and community in community engagement, arts and ecology. And we have decided to do what we can, or we've become interested in mycelium, soil fungi and biochar as a potential, or for its potential to address a number of environmental issues, principally as a means of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, as a means of increasing or improving soil biodiversity, the soil ecology, and also potentially the benefits that it can bring in terms of water quality. So the three of the things that John has talked about as issues locally here, but obviously around the world as well. So, thanks. Biochar and mycelium in combination there hasn't been a lot of research done into this, but we're hoping that the combination of biochar and mycelium together will introduce, or will be able to introduce, a healthy combination of microbes, that's the fungi, the bacteria, and all of the other microscopic organisms, back into the soil. We are hoping to produce biochar from agricultural waste and from woodland management waste, so wood chippings from on the estate. We're hoping to do everything as locally as possible to minimise any transport. So we're looking to use woodland management waste at the moment, but there is scope to use other materials as well, other organic matter as a feedstock for biochar. We've been doing we've been out a number of times with Christian Taylor, who was mentioned a minute ago. He's a mycologist, local mycologist, an expert in fungi. We've been out identifying different species in the woods around, in fact, just down the road here from Holbeton, on these fungal forays, go out and explore the woods and find the different species. The last time we went out, just one afternoon, we covered maybe a kilometre or so and found 26 different species. Each time we go out, we're finding different species coming up because they each have their own seasons and the climate, whether it's wetter or drier or at different times you get the different fruiting bodies coming up. What we're doing is we're hoping to use these local fungi to collect them, to culture them, and to add them to biochar mixes to use either in the soil or in some cases in water management arrangements. So if we go on to the next slide, please. The reason that it's important to get mycelium into the soil, to have mycelium in the soil, they're a very often undervalued but essential part of soil health. The mycelium are one of the groups, they're part of the fungi kingdom. They're particularly these white fibrous nets of fibres in the soil, and they're essential in the process of breaking down organic matter and turning it back into nutrients to feed the plants growing in the soil. A lot of plants, the vast majority of plants, have symbiotic relationships with mycelium in the soil, where the mycelium can collect and pass to the plant nutrients from the soil, and at the same time the plant will support the mycelium with sugars that it's made through photosynthesis. So there is, in the vast majority, something over 90% of plants have these symbiotic relationships with fungi, with soil fungi. Intensive agriculture, and in particular the addition of artificial fertilisers and fungicides and pesticides and so on, can have a dramatically negative effect on the microhabitat. Obviously, fungicides are designed to kill fungi, so it can't help the mycelium in the soil. So intensive farming can reduce the amount of fungi, the biodiversity in the soil, the fungi and the bacteria and the other invertebrates and all of the other organisms in the soil. All of which are interdependent in almost certainly unknown ways. There are so many complex relationships between these different organisms in the soil, and certainly the plants that we grow intentionally at the surface are dependent on all of these complex interactions. If anyone's interested, sorry, can we just go back a second? If anyone's interested, Paul Stamets, this was the book that inspired Shelley particularly to look into mycelium. He's written this fabulous book called Mycelium Running. I know quite a few people will have picked it up. Fascinating book about fungi in the soil and the use and the growing and the culturing of fungi. What biochar does, so the first question is, how is biochar different from charcoal? Biochar is just charcoal. It's organic matter, tends to be woody, or you can make it from straw or other agricultural wastes. But it's converted it's burnt in a limited atmosphere where the oxygen's limited. So rather than just burning and all turning to carbon dioxide, the vast majority of the carbon's retained as charcoal. It has this incredible microstructure. The tiny tubes that form the structure of the plant, end up as hollow tubes of carbon that are just the right size for mycelium to infiltrate into and for bacteria to grow into. So it forms a wonderful kind of scaffolding for soil microbes to grow into. So after you've produced the charcoal from whatever your feedstock is, you culture it. You can treat it with live cultures of soil microbes and fungi, mycelium, which grow into it and turn it into a wonderful soil addition. And it also locks carbon into the soil because the charcoal itself is pretty much inert in the soil. It doesn't decompose, whereas organic matter, when you put it in the soil, decomposes. Once you've charred it, it remains in the soil almost indefinitely. So it ends up being carbon that's been taken out of the atmosphere and put in the soil and will stay there pretty much permanently. So we go on to the next slide. So we've started, at the moment we haven't even made any charcoal, any biochar yet. We've only really just started. We had a kick-off last month We've got a little bit of funding, which is great, from the Devon Environment Foundation. We've started exploring the woods and collecting different local fungi to culture, hopefully to use for this biochar mycelium mix. Once we've got some biochar made, which should be in the next month or so, we should start producing biochar. We'll start culturing it with these different kinds of fungi, and we've got engagement with some academics from Plymouth University, some scientists who are going to do some experiments on it to see how effective it is in removing. In one application, we're going to be hopefully using it to remove potential pollutants from surface water. So it shows great promise, or potentially has great promise, in removing pollutants, particularly artificial fertilisers, pathogenic bacteria, hopefully, or it has been shown to be beneficial, and other chemicals from surface water. So we're going to be trying different combinations of mycelium and biochar in different application methods to see where we can get the most benefit, and then hopefully apply on a larger scale when we can work out what the best way of applying it is. So if we go on. What we hope to achieve. So one of the targets is water quality. We're hoping to come up with these different ways of applying it in the field. So one thing is, if it's in the soil, as the rain falls and percolates through the soil, rather than washing nutrients out of the soil and into the surface water, the falling rain ends up being soaked up by the biochar, or remains in the soil longer, and the biochar also chemically or physically and chemically captures some of the nutrients and holds them in the soil longer, so they don't run off the fields into the watercourses where they're effectively pollution. The nutrients stay in the soil for the plants to use to grow. So we're hoping to be able to demonstrate reductions in runoff of nutrients from the fields into the water. Also in these ways of putting bags in the water, putting Hessian sacks in the flowing water as bunds around the edges of the fields to filter the water as a form of microfiltration to remove bacteria that would otherwise end up in the watercourses. So attenuation of the flow, again acting as a sponge in the soil, absorbing the water and keeping it in the soil so that the water content of the soil remains more consistent over time. Ultimately, hopefully to improve soil health and biodiversity, and as I mentioned already, as a method of getting carbon back into the soil. As part of that, we're hoping to do more community engagement to get more people involved with the methods and the ways we're doing this. One of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be asking for some volunteers to come and do some water sampling towards the end of next week. We've got some academics again who are going to come and do some water sampling on the brook here to look at nutrients in the water, runoff in the water, and bacteria in the water. So if you're interested in getting involved in some citizen science, do come and find me afterwards, and I'll give you the details to contact us. But numbers are limited, I'm afraid. And finally, science outputs. One of the reasons for getting the scientists involved from Plymouth, and we have a number of others engaged as well, is because the use of biochar, although it's anecdotally been shown to be very, very useful in soils in promoting soil health and increasing yields, there's always a lot of variability in the environment that it's applied in and the way it's applied. So we're looking to get some good science out of it, and we've got some students involved to write up papers on their research. Next slide. This is just a couple of illustrations of on the right hand side there, what's called terra preta. This is some of the history of biochar in South America, in the Amazon it was found that these particularly fertile black soils, terra preta, over hundreds, if not thousands of years, have been treated with biochar, have been treated with charcoal, and have increased the nutrients in the soil a great deal, and have a great benefit on the yield, on the productivity of the soil. And then on the left here, there's a photo of this is actually just a doormat that's been treated with a Mycelium, I'm not sure which one this is actually, oyster mushroom, it is oyster mushroom. So this is what happens if your doormat gets infected or inoculated with oyster mushrooms. It actually converts the oyster mushroom, the mycelium of the oyster mushroom infiltrate the entire structure, and normally you don't see the fruiting body, normally you don't see anything on the surface until it's triggered to produce these great mushrooms at the surface. And these oyster mushrooms, in this case, these are edible oyster mushrooms, one of the species that looks like it will be quite useful in removing pollutants from water. And I think that's me actually. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right then, folks, so thanks very much.
Frank,
Frank.
stay there.
Well, nice to see you again. So that's 55 minutes, and we're going to take a little interlude now for questions, if you've got any, and feel free to fire them out randomly, and we'll choose somebody to take it on. Anyone got any questions they want? Chris?
A question for Johnny Haimes. Johnny, can you just expand on how you conserve your winter feed? And also you mentioned lays. How do you renew your lays?
So,
Did everyone get it? Yeah.
conserving what we do with our bale grazing. So there's always a surplus when we come into May, June, we have a surplus of grass. And we'll cut that grass, we'll make bales, and we'll put the bales to the side of the field. And then we might have another cut in July or August, depending on what sort of year we've had, what sort of rainfall we've had. Again, put the bales to the side of the field. Then when it comes to the autumn, I just make a calculation to see what cattle I've got to overwinter, what deferred grass I got, how many bales I've made during the year, and then I'll just lay the bales out in a line. You know, say that this year there's 11 bales, they'll have an acre of deferred grass with those 11 bales, and that will be a 5-month winter for us then, just moving the cattle, 220 odd cattle daily through those 11 bales basically. So it's a calculation in the autumn, and then when we come to the spring, this time of year when it starts drying up a little bit, actually because I move them daily, they don't poach the ground, and we've got quite free draining soils. So it's just a case of we scratch some seed over where the bales have been. I move any, if they've left a bit of silage, I just move it off with a grab, and then we just scratch on some more herbal lay seed, and on we go again.
And how do you renew your lays?
I haven't done yet. I mean, that's sort of renewing them as we go. So a lot's, I might use £1,000 worth, £1,500 worth of seed a year going over where the bales have been. And actually, what I found the last couple of years is a lot of the red clovers and things go to seed, because I'm not necessarily there to graze it, and then the cattle go over, they'll push those clover heads in, push the seed in. So I think in part it's renewing itself, but
A permanent pasture system, really.
Essentially it's there. They say the red clover dies out after 3 years, but I'm in my 3rd year now of the herbal lays, and I haven't seen any evidence of that. Maybe because I've just let some of the red clover go to seed.
Great. John, come and have a seat.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, maybe.
I just wanted to sort of make a point rather than ask a question, if I may. But as a tenant farmer on the estate myself, I just want to make people aware farms, but like at home, for example, we have a crop rotation, we have buffer strips, we have break crops, all of which are very good for the soil and for biodiversity. And we've all been farming sustainably, as 99% of British farmers are for a very long time. So it's not a new thing. I just want people to know that we are farming sustainably already and have been for a long time.
And it's brilliant. Well done too, John.
I think it's a good point, because a lot of what sustainable farming now is looking back to more traditional methods that are being used and are being forgotten. So I think Joe's the one that said, it's the monocultures, a lot of monocultures that have been running this and not having this diversity, but actually having a rotation, like you're saying, and doing that is the correct way to do it.
Monocultures aren't really a thing we have in England anyway. That's sort of the thing that happens in Brazil. So
maybe some of the grass farms, if you've got just ryegrass you're growing, potentially as a monoculture, I guess.
Big East Anglian farms.
Yeah, I think that's what the regenerative agriculture movement is looking at, is instead of whatever species of grass we're growing here, and I'm not an expert because I work in a hospital, you can start to maybe cut less or graze those areas less frequently, so that whatever species you have got are going to seed, and you're allowing those native species to come back all the time rather than constantly grazing areas. But it's a wonderful topic to discuss about grazing management plans and what impacts people find they're having in different places. That's good. That's it from me, thank you. Penny. Sorry, Penny. Stephen first was waiting in the corner.
Okay.
Sorry.
Swifts, are they declining because there's a lack of places for them to nest here, or is there any other reason?
Past logistics to ecology.
So historically a lot of swifts used to nest within the eaves of buildings, so buildings often have little gaps in the eaves, in the roofs, under the tiles, or in the corners of the guttering, and over time as people renew the houses and work on them, those get filled in, and over time it's become more and more common that natural nest sites have been lost. So because they come back to the same nest hole nearly every year, once they lose that, they can functionally become a non-breeding bird despite wanting to breed. And because they're so fixed on a colony that they use, there's very little movement between different sites, that once that site becomes unavailable, they just come back, fly around with the others, but then just don't breed. There are issues both on migration, so storms are becoming more common in the spring around the Mediterranean, so that's one of the reasons swallows have gone down so much over the last 3 to 5 years. So they've had a few really bad migrations, they've hit storms in the Med. But also there are issues happening on their wintering grounds, so that's just starting to be looked into. There's little devices they're starting to fit to swifts to understand where they're going during the non-breeding season, and looking at the habitats they're feeding in and trying to understand how they're changing as well and what may be influencing declines. But they have gone down 50-60% since the 70s, so they are still going down, but there's quite a lot of work now starting to come forward on understanding why and looking to improvements.
So that helps you. Good.
Just thinking about biodiversity and corridors for nature, and thinking about hedges, do we have a plan for how we're looking after our hedges in the area? Is there still going to be lots of flailing? Do we let them grow up? Do we lay?
I can see lots of people in the audience who I think probably have a very good answer to that question.
Yeah, what's the
does anybody from the audience want to take an answer, or shall we go to the team at the top? So I know that there's some very good hedge management going on. I've seen it in just driving around. Does anybody want to take it? The team at the top.
Is there a strategy for Flete and for the Flete hedges?
Do you
at
mean
the moment?
Flete is in the in-hand farming land, or?
Yeah.
In the in-hand farming land is at the moment we're letting them grow up and looking to cut them every 2 years,
Right.
but also looking how we can infill them. But it's down to the individual farmer and how they need it for their practice, I think. So I'd be wary of trying to do an overarching strategy and telling people what to do.
Yeah.
So there is the issue that if you flail year after year at the same point, you get these nodules start to form, and eventually the hedge can start to die and become very gappy. So some hedges are starting to get to that point where after 60 years of flailing, they are starting to become very gappy.
Yeah.
The options there become more limited, but you can let them grow up more significantly and then actually lay them and try and infill those gaps. And you can basically, when you lay the very tall stuff, you can basically root it back into the soil and create sort of steeples.
We've seen some severe, fairly severe hedge degradation up over up this way, but that was a strategy, I think, where they're letting some trees grow up through and then do something in between, but I don't know what was going on there. So
Good. This
you know,
might be a
I
good
think
point
hedges are quite
to say that if
important,
anyone's
aren't they?
interested in hedges on a smaller scale other than on your tenant farm, the Orchard, Tony Clarke, next pen, is organising a hedge laying course for the winter, and that's going to be advertised fairly soon, so you can come and learn how to lay a bit of hedge. And it's a good way to get out and about, and it's a dying skill, I think, but a really worthwhile skill to have.
Just on that, Joe, if
Yeah.
anyone's interested in doing that, we'll do a practical hedge laying course, and that might also, the waste from that we take out the hedge, we can use to make some biochar as well. So if anyone's interested in learning about hedge laying or biochar, come and see me.
And if anybody's interested in hedge laying or hedge management in a bigger scale, I'm working over at the Tamar Valley Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, and we're going to do a hedge event with George Holmes, who's the ranger at Cateel, in April. So do come and find me at the back, and we're going to be looking at different ways of managing hedges, because he's been doing some lovely work around creating more A-shaped hedges and putting a lot of fruit trees back into the hedges, which is one of the National Trust's kind of approaches that they're working on. But I've seen some fantastic hedges out on my work, where people are really thinking, because I think it's a fantastic habitat that's already there that can be really managed. But you know, it takes a lot of work and effort sometimes to be able to bring back things that have been lost.
Yeah, and the great thing about our landscape is our farmers are managing our hedges at the moment, putting a lot of work in, and a lot of landscapes around the world don't have these hedges at all. They come here and they're jealous of our hedges. So we should celebrate our hedges, however they're being managed, but try and work out scientifically what is the best way to manage our hedges to make it appropriate for agriculture and appropriate for ecology. Essentially, I think is my understanding.
A last pitch very quickly. So there's a group called More Meadows, and they've got a series of online hedges talks in a couple of weeks' time. So if you look online, and it's posted online, it's a free event, and they've got a series of speakers talking about hedge management on all sorts of scales.
Great. Yes, I think we'll make that our last question, and then I'll tell you what's going to happen next.
I just wondered, Frank, in terms of, I spent 15 years with the Wildlife Trust movement, and the lion's share of that was in landscape scale conservation, especially common grassland up in North Devon, which obviously is an absolute carbon sump, if you like. It acts as a carbon sink, and that holds carbon for up to a 25-year period, and obviously that's a very minute habitat that still actually is available worldwide, so we're very lucky to have that in Devon. But I just wondered how that, well, you might not know yet in terms of your findings, but in terms of biochar and actually the sequestration of carbon, is there any kind of indication how long it could act as a carbon sink for until that is released into the...
So there's a fair bit of debate about that at the moment in research. Obviously the trouble is to get an absolute answer, you need to have decades or centuries. It does look like the majority of the carbon stays in the soil almost indefinitely. There's certainly, in the short term, there is some leaching out of carbon, and it's probably the more volatile carbons that are being produced during the pyrolysis process. But you know, to have an absolute answer would take
sure, but it sounds like so long term.
It does. It certainly looks like, and from a chemistry point of view, the carbon itself isn't going to decompose. There's nothing that's going to consume or degrade the carbon. So it looks like it should be almost indefinite.
Thank you.
Can I add a quick point to that as well? Developing soils just in general will sequester carbon to a certain amount. If you've got quite a poor soil, it's obviously going to be made up of mainly weathering components. Whereas even if there is a significantly more organic matter, that's just going to sequester carbon. So having a good thick soil, regardless of whether it has biochar in it or not, will be. And biochar sounds like it's going to be a really good option for helping to enhance the soil to get it to that very sort of organic, rich portion of soils, which would be really helpful for sequestering carbon as well. So.
Great, thanks, good. So what I propose we do now, some of you might need to get away, some of you might need to go to the pub quiz. The pub does have a quiz going on, so we can't all go back there and order another drink, sadly. So what I would suggest is, if you want to stay, what I'll ask is, if you're in the back 3 rows, when you stand up, if you pick up your chair and just shift it to the side and stack them all on the side, it'll create an area at the back where I'm going to station these people and you can interrogate them. No hitting or pinching, just ask them questions. There are also a couple of things to mention is the orchard apple juice from our orchard is now drinkable all year round, lovely thing, and is for sale, and all proceeds go to the Community Orchard Group. We're looking after that. This Saturday the 12th there is lantern making workshops and the annual orchard pruning day that starts in the orchard at 10 o'clock in the morning through to 1 o'clock. And I think, Penny, we're providing some refreshments?
Yeah, we are. We've
Excellent.
got soup and rolls for if you want to come and do some pruning. And then in the evening, or you're going to say, we're doing the wassail.
Yeah, so then after that take a break and come back at 5:30 to the Mildmay colours, and we're going to do that wassail thing where everyone hits things and goes around the trees, and it's quite good fun.
And we've got mulled cider.
And we've got mulled cider and bits and pieces just for a bit of a laugh. And then I need some cash, if that's all right. So if Martin's going to go around with a collection box, and if you've got any money left, I'll be very grateful for the money for the Swift boxes, which we'll hopefully be putting up this spring if we can get it going. So yeah, back 3. Any other questions, points, things to raise? Back 3 rows, stack of chairs, and.